Good morning again. Thanks, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Meredith Reichert, Chief Commercial Officer of Karius, which is a company transforming infectious disease diagnostics through genomics and artificial intelligence. The Karius test is a non-invasive blood test that uses next-generation sequencing and AI to detect over 1,000 pathogens from a single sample, providing results within a day. It's especially valuable for immunocompromised patients where rapid identification of infections can mean the difference between recovery and severe outcomes. In May 2024, Karius closed a $100 million Series C round co-led by Khosla Ventures, 5AM Ventures, and Gilda Healthcare, with participation from Seventure Partners, SoftBank Vision Fund 2, General Catalyst, HBM Healthcare, and others. Not an easy thing to do in May of 2024. This funding is accelerating their commercial reach beyond the 400 U.S. hospitals already using the Karius test. The company has also received FDA Breakthrough Device designation this year for use in patients with suspected pneumonia, further validating its impact. Please join me in welcoming Meredith here to show how Karius is reshaping infectious disease care.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. You might be wondering why this infectious disease company is at a cancer conference. We've gotten that a lot over the years, but we're uniquely focused on serving immunocompromised patients, which are primarily cancer patients. As you probably well know, when you have an immunocompromised patient, they are especially at risk for infection, a diverse array of infection, and the clinical presentation of those infections is often abnormal compared to what you might find in an immunocompetent patient, meaning that traditional standard of care diagnostics, where you have a syndromic hypothesis and you go through your sequence of tests, often don't work. And so the standard yield in a cancer patient with infection of standard of care microbial testing is only 10 to 30%, meaning these patients have very high morbidity and mortality to those infections that are often treated inappropriately. So I'll get into the power of the product and these problems we're trying to solve in a little bit more depth. But first, I just want to give you a snapshot, maybe, of where we're at as a company right now. So right now, we're focused on serving patients who are hospitalized for infection. This is a big market. Unfortunately, there's about 8 million patients who are hospitalized for infection each year in the US alone. We're uniquely focused, again, on the 3 million immunocompromised patients who are hospitalized for infection. This is a large market because they're hospitalized. What that means is we're getting paid directly for the test. It's not reimbursed as it is for outpatient testing. It's then paid to us from the lab typically and bundled into the cost of that capitated payment for the hospitalized patient. It's one test that's testing for over 1,000 causes of infection. I'll get into more of that in a minute. It's used in about 500 hospitals across the US, ordered by over 8,000 ordering providers. We're fortunately growing at about 40% year over year with our revenue growth, and we maintain high margins, about in the top 10% of all NGS LDT companies. We're looking for big things as we grow. So our midterm horizon is outpatient. We have a PLA code and a price. We have an LCD that's been sitting with MolDX for about 18 months, so we're hoping we hear something soon. But that's a process, as you all know. Where we hope to serve these immunocompromised patients earlier in their care journey, hoping to avoid subsequent hospitalization and keep them on their care for the underlying malignancies. Eric mentioned the FDA Breakthrough designation. We're also working on a distributed kit, and so going through this process with the FDA so we can continue to move this test closer and closer to the patient. So what is a metagenomic liquid biopsy? So this is a fancy way to say we're measuring microbial cell-free DNA. So you might be familiar with other tests in cancer that are looking at circulating tumor DNA. We're specifically looking at microbial cell-free DNA. And again, we're focused on serving the most vulnerable patients. And so by the numbers, that means there's about 5 patients with cancer who are admitted to the hospital every minute for infection, and unfortunately, hundreds of those patients with cancer losing their lives to infection every day in the US.
And let me walk you through a little bit of that journey. So let's say we have a cancer patient who's been through a stem cell transplant, trying to help treat that infection. Unfortunately, 100% of those patients will be hospitalized for some infection in the next 18 months. Most commonly, it's pneumonia. From the Medicare data, that's on average a 19-day stay in the hospital, again, often without finding the underlying etiology. So there's a 26% readmission rate. Really high Medicare costs. A lot of that time is in the ICU, and unfortunately, a really high mortality rate. On the standard of care microbiology side, that's often 20 tests that are ordered over those first 7 days, extremely high costs, and again, high failure rate, which means not only a burden to the patient and to the hospital, but that means that's time for them off their cancer therapy, which they really need to be treating that underlying disease. So how do we work? So Karius is the first test to commercialize analysis of microbial cell-free DNA. So you can have an infection anywhere in the body, and those pathogens will be dividing and releasing highly degraded microbial cell-free DNA into the blood. This is a very small fraction of the DNA that's in the blood. So if you look on the right-hand side, if you're familiar with NIPT testing or circulating tumor DNA testing, those are much higher fractions. We have benefited from our original chemistry coming out of Stanford, Steve Quake's lab, that's able to uniquely isolate and enrich for microbial cell-free DNA. What's really cool about what we do is we can do the whole thing in about 24 hours, and that's very unique for a send-out NGS test. And so what happens is that the patient's blood draw will happen in a hospital. It'll get overnight shipped to our lab at ambient temperature, and then it takes us 1 day once we receive the sample to do the rest of the test. The proprietary elements are really that upfront chemistry, which again is uniquely enriching for that microbial cell-free DNA, but without the aid of probes and primers. The sequencing is standard. We use Illumina, NeauxCancer, and NovaSeq. And then we have a proprietary curated database and an AI-driven bioinformatic pipeline that's able to take all of that degraded DNA, identify at a species level what pathogen is there above healthy asymptomatic control levels, and get that report back to the patient. This is an example snapshot of a report that a physician might get from us. We categorize our pathogens in order to help interpret what's the most significant that we're finding. Here's a mycobacterium example. If it's one of 18 bacterial pathogens that might have one of these antimicrobial resistance markers that are important, methicillin, Van A, Van B, KPC, CTXM will also give them that information. We've been really fortunate that we've had publications not only sponsored by Karius, but by our customers over the years. So we now have over 200 publications that showcase our clinical validity and clinical utility. Often, customers will use the tests and then publish retrospectively on the clinical impact they've seen for their patients. And if we summarize those key takeaways, what we find is that the Karius test, now the Karius Spectrum, identifies 50 to 100% more diagnoses than culture. When you combine all of standard microbial testing combined, so PCR, antigen testing, staining, we still typically see 30% more to 200% more diagnoses, with the standard testing taking a week versus the 2-day turnaround time of the Karius Spectrum. This means that the time to disease identification is faster for 80% of patients. And it also means when used appropriately early in the care journey, you could avoid an invasive biopsy for that patient. Those can cause severe adverse complications, especially for immunocompromised patients. We've also found in studies where we've enrolled patients for pneumonia, we find causes of infection that are not due to pneumonia, but actually other types of infection that need to be treated in that patient. And that relates to the unbiased nature of the test. We're finding any pathogen there that shouldn't be there based on our healthy asymptomatic control cohort. We also find things earlier. So we can diagnose infections before clinical symptoms even appear. So at times we're used for high-risk patients for surveillance, where we can identify a fungal infection weeks before a patient shows symptoms and bacterial infections days to a week before clinical symptoms. So I want to take you through just 2 studies briefly to show you the impact of this test in cancer patients. This study was in patients with acute leukemia with febrile neutropenia, the Benamou study. And so this was a prospective observational study, which means results were not given in real time. But what we find, if you start on the left there, is that the Karius test found twice as many causes, adjudicated causes of disease, as all microbiology tests combined. When I say adjudicated, we had a panel of ID physicians who went through the results and identified the causative pathogens in both the Karius test and standard microbiology tests. What I think is really important is this middle panel, which showcases in orange that 2-day turnaround time to results of the Karius test versus this stair-step sequential findings of the standard microbial testing. So the Karius test giving that much more rapid turnaround time result. And what this adjudication committee also found on the far right there is that the Karius spectrum would have changed clinical care for 47% of patients. And so you can see there whether that was a targeting of antibiotics or a narrowing of antimicrobial therapy. Most importantly, this is the precision care that they need for the underlying etiology of their disease. One more study for you guys that we pulled like 3 or 4 papers out of it, so it's a really dense slide. This is called the Pickup Study. And so this was done across 10 leading cancer centers in the US with patients with hematological malignancy and suspected pneumonia. So keeping in mind that these are 10 leading cancer centers, their standard microbial testing bar is very, very high. They have access to all PCR testing, all antigen testing, and they're throwing all of that at these patients. What we found is that when we added the Karius test to that standard of care testing, we were able to increase the number of patients who had a diagnosis of their pneumonia by 40%. We had a unique group of patients, 12%, 21 patients, who were only diagnosed by the Karius test. And in those patients, 81% would have had a change in their antimicrobial management. So really impactful findings. So what we then did was modeled out the economic and outcomes journey for those patients to understand both the quality of life improvement and the cost effectiveness of the Karius test. And so what we saw is that with that appropriate antimicrobial treatment, those patients with the Karius test results would have had increased quality of life years, additional year compared to patients with just standard of care testing. And then when we incorporate costs into that, what that meant was we found that the Karius spectrum test was cost effective at about $16,000 cost per quality compared to standard of care alone. It's kind of a hard number to think about in isolation. What does that mean? But there's a general benchmark in US healthcare that cost effectiveness is about $50,000 per quality adjusted life year. And so at $16,000, we're well below that threshold of accepted cost per quality. So my last slide here is really focused on our commercial approach to the test. We're very fortunate that it's such a powerful product and we have so much evidence already. While we continue to improve the product and we continue to build evidence, the main focus of our company is expanding awareness, education, and our commercial reach. We benefit from a field team where we have a duo of sales and medical science liaisons in the field. It's a very technical test in some very clinically acute patients, and so having that extra depth of understanding from our medical science liaisons is really important for clinical understanding and appropriate use of the test. I also want to point you to the middle. This is not a test that should be used in every patient. Hopefully I've made clear that we really focus on the patients who need us most, these cancer patients and immunocompromised patients, and we try to voice that as we sell the test commercially. So we focus on partnering with our hospital customers on diagnostic stewardship and really walk with them with their first 5 tests to make sure they're using it appropriately, getting results that are meaningful for the patient, and then we'll do subsequent utilization reviews to look back at the value that the test has brought in these patient populations. So in addition to all the inpatient work we're focused on as a company, I'll remind you that we do expect to be able to expand to outpatient next year. MolDX goes well. And then we also expect this FDA-distributed kit in the years following that.
With that, I'd love to take any questions.